December 17th, 1944. Belgium, the Ardennes Forest. 3 days into what will become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive of World War II. German forces have punched through American lines. Chaos spreads across the front. Units are cut off, surrounded, destroyed. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black artillery unit, is in the middle of it. They've been firing their 155mm howitzers non-stop for 72 hours, supporting the 106th Infantry Division. Their guns are crucial. Each howitzer can throw a 95-pound shell 7 miles. They're one of the few things slowing the German advance. Then the German armor breaks through. Panzer tanks and infantry overrun American positions. The 333rd is cut off, surrounded, out of ammunition. The order comes: destroy the guns. Surrender is imminent. But here's what makes this story different. What makes the 333rd unique among the thousands of American units that fought in World War II. They didn't just surrender and wait for liberation. They didn't just survive captivity and come home after the war. They escaped, and they came back, and they fought again. Over 90 men from the 333rd were captured by German forces in December 1944. Within weeks, dozens had escaped from POW columns, evaded German patrols, crossed miles of enemy territory, and made it back to American lines. Then they grabbed weapons and went back to the fight. This isn't a story you've heard before, because for decades, the Army barely acknowledged it happened. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was written out of most Battle of the Bulge histories. Their POW experience was buried. Their escapes were footnoted. Their return to combat was ignored. This is the story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. The soldiers who were captured by the Nazis refused to stay captured and fought their way back to the war. If you want to see World War II stories where courage meets determination and no one stays defeated, subscribe right now. We're documenting forgotten stories from World War II. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. We want to know where people are discovering this history. This is the story of the battalion that wouldn't quit. Before we understand what happened to the 333rd in December 1944, you need to understand who they were and what they did. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was activated at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, in March 1943. They were an all-black unit in a segregated army. Black enlisted men with predominantly white officers, the standard structure designed to maintain racial hierarchy while using black soldiers for essential war work. But artillery was different from infantry. It required technical precision. Artillery isn't about charging enemy positions or holding ground. It's about mathematics, physics, and timing. It's about putting a 95-pound shell exactly where it needs to be, miles away from your position, without being able to see the target. For over a year, the 333rd trained at Camp Gruber. Artillery training was rigorous and technical. The soldiers learned gunnery fundamentals, ballistics, trajectories, how shells travel through air, accounting for wind, temperature, and gravity. They studied fire direction, calculating where to aim guns based on target coordinates relayed from forward observers. They practiced gun drill, the choreographed sequence where 8-man crews load, aim, and fire in coordinated rhythm. They trained on the 155mm howitzer, one of the most powerful artillery pieces in the American arsenal. The weapon stretched nearly 24 feet long and weighed over 7 tons. It could fire a 95-pound high-explosive shell up to 16,000 yards, more than 9 miles. The shells could destroy bunkers, break up infantry formations, or crater roads. Firing one required an 8-man crew working in perfect coordination. The men of the 333rd came from across America. Many were from the South, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, where economic opportunities for black men were severely limited. Others came from northern cities, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, where conditions were better but still constrained by racism. They were high school graduates, laborers, mechanics, farmers. Some had technical training. All had been judged capable of mastering complex artillery systems. They knew they were being tested. Every black unit in World War II operated under scrutiny. Success proved black soldiers' capability. Failure, or even average performance, would be used as evidence that black soldiers couldn't handle technical operations. The 333rd performed exceptionally well in training. They qualified on their weapons, passed their tests, and were certified combat ready. In October 1944, the 333rd shipped to Europe. They arrived in France and were assigned to support operations in Belgium and Luxembourg. This was the tail end of the Allied advance across Europe. The successful D-Day invasion had pushed German forces back, and by autumn, American armies were approaching Germany's border. The 333rd was attached to 8th Corps, supporting the 106th Infantry Division. The 106th was a green division, newly arrived, never tested in combat. They'd been assigned to a quiet sector of the line in the Ardennes forest, a region where commanders expected little German activity. The 333rd set up their guns and began fire missions. Within weeks, they were providing artillery support for infantry operations, responding to calls for fire, and proving their competence under actual combat conditions. Everything seemed routine. The war in Europe appeared to be winding down. Germany was clearly losing. Victory seemed inevitable. Then came December 16, 1944. At 5:30 a.m., German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes, thousands of guns firing simultaneously. It was the largest German artillery barrage since 1940. Then came the tanks, panzers pushing through the American lines. Then infantry, elite German units that had been held in reserve, now committed to one final desperate offensive. Hitler's plan was ambitious and reckless. Punch through the American lines, drive to Antwerp on the Belgian coast, cut off Allied supply lines, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. It required speed, surprise, and the assumption that American units would break and run. The offensive achieved surprise. American commanders had dismissed intelligence warnings about German buildups. The 106th Infantry Division, the unit the 333rd was supporting, was completely unprepared. Within hours, German forces had broken through in multiple places. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion suddenly found itself in the middle of the largest battle American forces would fight in Western Europe. Their position went from quiet sector to combat zone in a matter of hours, and they did what artillerymen do: they started firing. The 333rd responded to the German assault by doing what they'd been trained to do: fire. Their 155mm howitzers began throwing shells at German positions as fast as crews could load them. Fire missions came in continuously. German armor here, infantry concentration there, artillery position identified, counter-battery fire requested. The 333rd's guns fired until the barrels glowed, but the situation deteriorated rapidly. The 106th Infantry Division was being overwhelmed. 2 entire regiments of the 106th were surrounded within 24 hours. German forces were pushing through gaps in the American lines. Communication broke down. Units lost contact with headquarters. The front line, which had been stable for weeks, suddenly became fluid and chaotic. By the evening of December 16th, it was clear the 333rd was in serious danger. German forces were approaching their gun positions. The battalion received orders to displace, military terminology for pack up and move before you're overrun. But displacing artillery isn't quick. Each 155mm howitzer weighs over 7 tons. It requires tractors to move. Ammunition has to be loaded. Equipment has to be secured. and the roads were clogged with American units trying to retreat. By the morning of December 17th, German forces had encircled portions of the 333rd. Several batteries found themselves cut off from the rest of the battalion and from other American units. They were surrounded by German armor and infantry. The batteries continued firing as long as they had ammunition. When ammunition ran low, they destroyed their gun sights, specialized optical equipment that allowed accurate aiming. They disabled their howitzers by removing breech blocks or spiking the barrels. The goal was to make the guns unusable to the Germans even if they captured them. As German infantry closed in, small groups of 333rd soldiers attempted to escape through the woods. Some made it, many didn't. By the afternoon of December 17th, over 90 soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion had been captured by German forces. They were now prisoners of war. Before we continue with the main story of the 333rd, we need to address the darkest moment of the battalion's experience. On December 17th, 11 soldiers from the 333rd's Battery C escaped their surrounded position and made it to the village of Wereth, Belgium. They sought shelter at a farmhouse owned by a Belgian family, the Lange family. The Langers took them in, gave them food, and tried to help. The 11 men were Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Turner, Corporal Major Bradley, Private First Class James A. Stewart, Private First Class Curtis Adams, Private First Class Robert Green, Private George Davis Jr., Private Jim Leatherwood, Private Nathaniel Moss, Private George W. Motton, Private William E. Pritchett, and Private Dew W. Turner. Their bodies weren't discovered until February 1945, after the area was recaptured. The massacre investigation went nowhere. The SS unit responsible was never conclusively identified, and no one was prosecuted. The Wereth massacre represents the intersection of war crimes and racial hatred. The SS soldiers who committed this atrocity saw Black American soldiers not just as enemy combatants, but as racially inferior targets for violence. It was murder fueled by Nazi ideology. The 11 men of Wereth deserve to be remembered. Their story is separate from the escape narrative we're about to tell, but it's part of the 333rd's experience in December 1944. For the other 80-plus soldiers from the 333rd who were captured and survived, December 17th marked the beginning of a different ordeal. They were rounded up, disarmed, and formed into columns. German guards marched them east, away from the front, deeper into German-held territory, toward POW camps in Germany. The conditions were brutal. It was winter in Belgium, temperatures below freezing, snow on the ground. The captured Americans had no winter coats, inadequate boots, little food. They marched for hours, guards prodding them forward. Some men had been wounded in the fighting and received no medical care. They marched anyway, or were shot. The Germans marched POW columns at night to avoid Allied air attacks. During the day, prisoners huddled in barns or forests, trying to stay warm. Food was scarce, a piece of bread, maybe some watery soup. Water came from snow melted in their hands, and the prisoners walked, mile after mile through frozen countryside, guarded by German soldiers with rifles and dogs. This is where most POW stories would end, captured, imprisoned, waiting for liberation or war's end. But the men of the 333rd had a different plan. We're about to show you how dozens of soldiers from the 333rd escaped from German captivity and made it back to American lines through enemy territory in the middle of winter. If you're watching a story where determination and courage overcome impossible odds, make sure you're subscribed. We're documenting the World War II stories where black soldiers refused to accept defeat. Comment with where you're watching from. This history needs witnesses around the world. The POW columns marched east through Belgium and into Germany, guarded by German soldiers, watched by dogs, supposedly secure. But the men of the 333rd had no intention of staying prisoners. Most prisoners of war in World War II didn't attempt to escape. It was dangerous. If caught, you could be shot. It was difficult. You were in enemy territory, didn't speak the language, had no supplies, no maps, no civilian clothes. The odds of success were low, and for American POWs, there was a calculation. The war seemed to be ending. Germany was clearly losing. If you could just survive a few months in a POW camp, liberation would come. But the men of the 333rd faced a different calculation. They were black soldiers in Nazi hands. The Nazis' racial ideology considered black people inferior, subhuman. The Wereth massacre had already demonstrated that some German units would murder black POWs rather than treat them according to Geneva Convention rules. Would POW camps be safe for black Americans? Would they receive the same treatment as white POWs? Or would they face worse conditions, abuse, or execution? The soldiers didn't know, but they knew staying captured was risky. Escaping was risky too, but at least it was action, not passive waiting. And there was another factor. They were soldiers, artillerymen, trained, capable, disciplined. The idea of sitting out the war in a prison camp while their fellow soldiers fought didn't sit well. They wanted back in the fight, so they started escaping. Escapes from the POW columns happened in several ways. Some were opportunistic, a moment when guards weren't watching closely, a prisoner slipping into the woods during a rest stop. Some were planned, soldiers watching guard patterns, identifying weak points, choosing the moment to run. Night marches provided opportunities. The columns moved in darkness to avoid Allied aircraft. Guards couldn't watch everyone constantly in the dark. Men would drift to the back of the column, then drop behind when guards weren't looking. By the time guards realized someone was missing, the escapee was gone into the forest. Some escapes happened during Allied air attacks. American and British planes strafed German columns when they could identify them. During attacks, guards would take cover and POWs would scatter. Some prisoners of war used the chaos to disappear into the countryside. Some escapes were bold. Prisoners would simply walk away from the column when guards were distracted, betting that in the confusion of war, one missing prisoner wouldn't be immediately noticed. The escapes weren't easy. Most required running through snow-covered forests in inadequate clothing, with no food, no compass, no clear direction except west toward American lines. Guards would sometimes pursue escapees with dogs. Recaptured escapees could be beaten or shot, but dozens of men from the 333rd took the risk. Once free of the POW column, the real challenge began. You're in enemy territory, Belgium or Western Germany, in December 1944. You're an American soldier, probably black, in a US Army uniform. You don't speak German or French. You have no food, no money, no map. And you're trying to reach American lines that are somewhere west of here, through territory occupied by German forces. The soldiers who escaped had to survive in winter conditions. They scavenged food from abandoned farms, ate snow for water, and found shelter in barns or forests. They moved at night to avoid German patrols and hid during the day. Some soldiers traveled alone. Others found each other and moved in small groups. Belgian civilians played a crucial role. Many Belgians hated the German occupation and helped Allied soldiers when they could. Escapees would approach isolated farmhouses, hoping the occupants would provide food, shelter, or directions. Many Belgians did help, risking their own lives. German policy was brutal towards civilians who aided Allied soldiers. They could be executed. The escapees navigated using basic principles. The front is west, so go west. They listened for sounds of artillery fire, American guns firing east, German guns firing west. They followed distant explosions. They moved toward the sounds of fighting, which meant they were getting closer to the front lines. The distances varied. Some escapees were only a few miles from American lines when they escaped. Others were dozens of miles deep in German-held territory. The journeys took days or weeks. The soldiers who made it back to American lines arrived in various states, cold, hungry, exhausted, but alive and free. They reached American outposts and identified themselves. Many still had their dog tags, which proved who they were. Others had lost everything, but could describe their unit, their officers, their service. American units that received these escapees were often amazed. Escaped POWs were relatively rare. Escaped POWs who'd traveled through enemy territory for days were rarer still. Black soldiers escaping from Nazi captivity and making it back seemed almost unbelievable. But it happened. Over and over through late December 1944 and January 1945, soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion straggled back to American lines. One by one, or in small groups, they returned. The exact number who escaped successfully isn't definitively documented. Records from the period are incomplete. The Battle of the Bulge created chaos in American record-keeping. But historical research suggests dozens of men from the 333rd escaped and made it back to American lines. And when they made it back, they didn't ask to be sent to the rear. They didn't request reassignment away from combat. They asked for weapons, because they were going back to the fight. The soldiers who escaped and made it back to American lines faced a question. What happens now? In most armies, escaped POWs would be sent to the rear. Medical evaluation, debriefing, rest, reassignment away from the front. The logic is sound. You've been through trauma, you need recovery time, and you've provided valuable intelligence about enemy positions and treatment of POWs. But this was December 1944 and January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging. Every available soldier was needed. The American command was scraping together cooks, clerks, and support personnel to throw into the fight. The German offensive had created a manpower crisis, and the men of the 333rd didn't want to go to the rear anyway. As escaped members of the 333rd made it back to American lines, the army began reconstituting the battalion. Not all of the original battalion had been captured. Some batteries had successfully withdrawn, some soldiers had evaded capture initially. Combined with the escapees returning, there were enough men to reform the unit. But they'd lost their artillery pieces. The 155mm howitzers had been destroyed or captured. Artillery doesn't work without guns. The army assigned the 333rd new howitzers. Gun crews reformed. Fire direction teams reorganized. Within weeks of the escapes, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was back in action, providing artillery support for American forces driving the Germans back. Imagine what these men went through. You're captured in combat. You're marched through enemy territory as a prisoner. You escape, travel through freezing forests with no food or supplies, evade German patrols, and make it back to friendly lines. You're exhausted, hungry, probably suffering from exposure and frostbite. And then you volunteer to go back to the guns and start firing at the Germans again. Why? Several motivations emerged from the historical record and veteran accounts. First, there was unfinished business. They'd been forced to destroy their guns and surrender. That wasn't how soldiers wanted their story to end. Getting back to the fight meant reclaiming agency. They weren't victims, they were combatants. Second, there was loyalty to comrades. Other units were still fighting. The war wasn't over. Going to the rear while others fought would feel like abandonment. Third, there was the proving ground dynamic that every black unit faced. The 333rd had performed well before the capture. Escaping and returning to combat was another opportunity to demonstrate competence, courage, and commitment. It was evidence that black soldiers could not only fight, but could overcome adversity that would break other men. And fourth, there was probably anger. They'd been captured, forced to march, witnessed the murder of their brothers at Wereth, and suffered in enemy hands. Firing artillery shells at German positions was payback. The reconstituted 333rd Field Artillery Battalion participated in the Allied counter-offensive that eventually pushed German forces back and ended the Battle of the Bulge. They provided fire support for infantry advances, knocked out German positions, and disrupted enemy movements. Through January and February 1945, the 333rd continued operations in Belgium and Germany. They were part of the Allied advance across the Rhine River and into Germany itself. They fired missions supporting infantry units clearing German towns and cities. The battalion served through the end of the war in Europe, which came in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. They'd gone from captured and presumed lost in December 1944 to active combat units at war's end 6 months later. The 333rd's experience in December 1944 and afterward came at a cost. The 11 men murdered at Wereth, others who died in the initial combat. POWs who didn't escape or didn't survive escape attempts. Men who made it back but were wounded in subsequent fighting. The psychological toll was also significant. Being captured, witnessing atrocities, escaping through enemy territory, and then returning to combat, all within weeks, would today be recognized as severe trauma. In 1945, there was no PTSD diagnosis, no mental health support for combat veterans. The soldiers were expected to function, and they did. But the cost was real. May 1945. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion had survived. Capture, escape, return to combat, final victory. They'd proven everything they needed to prove. They'd been tested in the most intense battle American forces fought in Western Europe. They'd been captured and escaped. They'd come back and fought until the end. They expected recognition, unit citations, commendations. At minimum, acknowledgement of what they'd endured and accomplished. It didn't come. The Army's official histories of the Battle of the Bulge, written in the late 1940s and 1950s, barely mentioned the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. A footnote here, a brief paragraph there. The capture was noted in passing. The escapes weren't highlighted. The return to combat was ignored. Why? The reasons were never officially stated, but they're obvious to anyone familiar with how the military handled black units' achievements. Recognizing the 333rd's exceptional performance, captured but refusing to stay captured, escaping through enemy territory, returning to fight, would undermine arguments that black soldiers couldn't handle the stress of frontline combat. It would prove that black soldiers possessed courage, initiative, and determination equal to or exceeding white soldiers. The Army wasn't ready to admit that. Desegregation wouldn't come until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. Until then, maintaining the fiction that black soldiers were less capable justified continued segregation. So the easier path was to minimize the 333rd story. Mention them briefly. Don't dwell on the escapes. Don't emphasize the return to combat. Move on to other units. The 11 men massacred at Wereth received no recognition for decades. The Army investigated the massacre in 1945, but never identified the perpetrators conclusively. No one was prosecuted. The case was closed. The massacre wasn't mentioned in most Battle of the Bulge histories. The 11 men's names weren't widely known. There was no memorial at the site where they died. For 50 years, the Wereth massacre was nearly forgotten. In the 1990s and 2000s, historians researching black military service in World War II began uncovering the 333rd story. They found after-action reports documenting the capture. They found escape reports filed by returning soldiers. They interviewed surviving veterans. The documentation had been there all along, buried in archives. It just hadn't been highlighted. Norman Lichtenfeld, a historian and researcher, became particularly focused on the Wereth massacre. He worked with Belgian locals who'd preserved knowledge of what happened. Together, they pushed for recognition of the 11 murdered men. In 2004, 60 years after the massacre, a memorial was erected at Wereth, Belgium. It honors the 11 soldiers from the 333rd Battery C who were murdered there. The memorial lists their names, their ranks, their ages. It acknowledges the war crime that was committed against them. Surviving veterans of the 333rd traveled to Belgium for the dedication. They were in their 80s, finally seeing recognition for their brothers who'd been murdered 6 decades earlier. Today, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion is included in Battle of the Bulge histories. Their capture, escapes, and return to combat are acknowledged. Museums include their story. Educational materials teach about them. But recognition came 60 to 70 years too late for most of the men who served. Of the soldiers who were captured and escaped, most died before their story was recovered. They lived their lives knowing what they'd done, but seeing no official acknowledgement. The question remains, why did it take so long? The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was captured by the Nazis, escaped through enemy territory, and fought until Germany surrendered. They proved that determination and courage can overcome any obstacle, and that institutional racism tries to bury even the most undeniable achievements. December 1944 to May 1945. 6 months that defined the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Captured in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, marched as prisoners through enemy territory, escaped and evaded through frozen forests, made it back to American lines, grabbed new weapons and returned to the fight, served until Germany's surrender. The 333rd story teaches lessons that transcend their specific experience. Being captured doesn't mean being defeated. The soldiers of the 333rd faced one of the worst situations soldiers can face, becoming POWs in enemy hands, uncertain of survival, witnessing atrocities against their brothers. They could have accepted captivity and waited for liberation. Instead, they took action. They escaped. They risked being shot to regain their freedom. That's courage. Not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. The escapes required determination that most people can't comprehend. Traveling through enemy territory in winter with no supplies, no clear direction, no guarantee of success, every step could lead to recapture or death. But they kept moving. They refused to be passive victims of circumstance. That's agency, the choice to act rather than be acted upon. The 333rd story was buried for 60 years, not because it wasn't documented, but because recognizing it would challenge racist assumptions about black soldiers' capabilities. Institutional racism doesn't just deny opportunities, it denies recognition for achievement that's already occurred. The 333rd proved themselves beyond any doubt, and the army ignored them anyway. For 6 decades, the 333rd was a footnote. Then historians recovered their story. That recovery matters, not just for historical accuracy, but for present understanding of who contributed to victory and what they overcame. The 333rd story is now taught in schools, displayed in museums, and honored at memorials. That recognition came too late for most who served, but it ensures their sacrifice and courage won't be forgotten again. The 11 murdered at Wereth: Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Turner, Corporal Mager Bradley, Private First Class James A. Stewart, Private First Class Curtis Adams, Private First Class Robert Green, Private George Davis Jr., Private Jim Leatherwood, Private Nathaniel Moss, Private George W. Motton, Private William E. Pritchett, and Private Dew W. Turner. The dozens who escaped and made it back to the fight. Their names fill pages of after-action reports and escape debriefs. Most never made famous, but all heroes. The entire 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, over 500 men who served, fought, endured, and overcame. They were captured, they escaped, they came back, they fought until victory. They were the battalion that wouldn't quit.